And the guy from Trump's team saying, hang on a minute, you've manipulated that clip. You've put those two bits together. There is a certain class of person within the BBC who work in a ecosystem where they are all believing the same sort of thing. And you have people like me who are a little bit more questioning. There is, within the sort of the hierarchy of the BBC, there are a lot of middle class people, and it's a lot of people joke it's sort of the North London set or the Islington set or whatever it is.
Today, I'm joined by David Chaudoir, a veteran graphic designer who spent over 30 years across film, TV, advertising, and the BBC. David's views are his own, and he uses this conversation to speak openly about class, culture, and editorial behaviour inside the corporation. He discusses witnessing a doctored Newsnight clip relating to Trump's Capitol riot speech, which led him to speak to The Telegraph out of concern for what he saw as a growing culture problem within the BBC. Since speaking out, he's had both thanks and backlash, but he says staying quiet was never an option. David argues that a dominant middle-class environment has limited genuine diversity of thought and pushed working-class voices further to the margins. Drawing on his experiences at ITV, in film and in advertising, he compares how class dynamics differ across the industry and why he feels the BBC has drifted away from everyday audiences. How was that? Was that good?
Fine. Yeah, it's fine. Absolutely. I mean, it's obviously you've got your focus, and obviously your main concern and your main interest is class and the class dynamic and how it plays into within a company. And I hadn't really, before you talked about it, I hadn't really thought about that, to be honest with you. But it is fairly obvious
Okay.
especially about the BBC, and as you know, my opinions about ITV and different broadcasters have, and different industries have different cultures. And the film industry has a very different culture as well. So,
Okay.
yeah, I think that was a reasonable introduction.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, because as you said, this series is about class and those from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Your story is going to be slightly different, and our focus, will be more about the class aspect. Because my series is about working class, how would you define what working class is? And I'm guessing your
Yeah,
background isn't that.
yeah. I mean, I I personally think that the old stratifications between working class, upper working class, if there is such a thing, middle class, upper class, and sort of nobility have changed. Personally, I think that when you have somebody like a character like David Beckham, who now is almost sort of, you have the celebrity class now. You have people who start off working class. You have, what do they call it? Social mobility,
Yeah.
that people can start in one class and end up in another. And I grew up in a household which I would call poor middle class, which was, my parents had grown up in very wealthy households with very traditional upper middle class, backgrounds, the military, and my father's mother married into nobility. She was married to somebody who was a baronet, and that kind of thing. And yet my parents weren't wealthy, but I suppose, there were certain markers that make you stand out as middle class. I think now as well, my my sons are carpenters, so they work in trades. And traditionally, the working class were people who you know, worked. And if you look at a Victorian photograph, you can look at a Victorian photograph and you can say, that man's a baker, that man's a butcher, that man's a chimney sweep. You pretty much class distinction was obvious, but almost by uniform. And I think that sort of working class used to be, you could say you were in a trade, um, and you provided something, and that set about your class. But I think that has changed. I don't think you can look at somebody on the street these days and tell what class they're in.
Hmm.
I think, whether it's the clothes we wear, the way we speak, I think is in such flux at the moment, that it's really hard to tell. And class mobility is there. I think that there is um, the way I would say it now was that people who've grown up on council estates and their parents both work in a trade or for the NHS or that kind of service culture or in a shop, I would possibly qualify that as working class. But, again, within that, you have mobility as well. People don't stay in council houses. They have aspirations to own their own property. I don't know why, with mortgages and taxes as they are.
As I mentioned, you've had like 30 years experience within basically it's like the media industry, and then you end up at Newsnight. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience at the BBC and what kind of made you lift the lid on what was going on there?
Okay, so as you say, I worked in graphic design. I initially started out in broadcast TV. I started out at a production company in West London called Diverse Production that was set up by Channel 4 in the same way that Phil Redmond started Brookside, and that was a production company was set up for that particular show. Channel 4 also set up Diverse Production, which was set up to do a current affairs program called Checkout. So I worked on Checkout. I graduated in 1990 and I worked on that. Beyond that, in 1995, I then had a series of other jobs in advertising, in design companies that designed stuff for television. I directed commercials, I directed music videos, I freelanced around. And after COVID, I knew that there were freelancers or there are freelance opportunities at the BBC, specifically in news. So I got a job as a freelancer on Newsnight, which I absolutely loved. I loved the sort of the pressure of it. Um, I loved the freedom, the fact that you could effectively design the studio. So behind the presenter are these very high definition displays, and you would, as a graphic designer, you would design the image that goes in the display to set up the story. So the presenter, whether it was Kirsty Walk or whoever it was, would be sitting in front of these displays. So that was part of the job, was designing these backgrounds. And then another part of the job was obviously telling the stories, so if somebody had some vaguely complex thing about energy supply or whatever it was, or a map of the Ukraine, or obviously later on the Gaza conflict, we would illustrate those. But I was working on quite early on the shifts that you took. Okay, so quite early on, I was sort of promoted, as it were, to lead designer
Yeah.
on certain shifts, which means you are the head designer. You go to the editorial meetings. So you sit around with journalists and producers and presenters and, special correspondents, and well, not always as special correspondents, but they talk about the upcoming show. They talk about what's going to happen, stories. There are obviously stories coming in. There are also dates in the calendar. It might be London Fashion Week, or it might be, there's films coming out, or there might be, there's going to be something in the House of Commons, and, they're talking about, and the show sort of coalesces at about 4 p.m. really. And then you make all the graphics, and then the show obviously went out at 10 o'clock. Now, the specific incident that happened was I was working, as I said, it was 2022, and I was working on a show, and it's the Capitol riot, or the insurrection as it was called, happened on January the 6th, 21. And this was in 2022. So it was a really big deal in terms of the media, that the media in America, CNN, NBC, whatever, were calling it the insurrection. It was a bunch of, MAGA people breaking into the Capitol, enacting violence, etc., etc. And I have always been quite broad-minded. I've always been taking my news and media from other places. I'm quite prepared to watch YouTube, look at X, as well as I've also watched bits on Fox, and my politics isn't necessarily right-wing. I have views that come from the left, whether that's belief in the NHS. I have centrist beliefs, and I have right-wing beliefs. I think all of us aren't black and white. I think that we have a broad range. If we examine what we really believe in, we have a broad range of ideas and beliefs that come from across the political spectrum. So, the riot was being reported on, and I think it was early 2022. I can't remember exactly what the story was about, but they edited together this famous, what they call splicing, where you put one bit of time to another, and they conflated it by 50 minutes. So you had Trump saying, we're going to go to the Capitol building, and we're going to you're going to cheer on some of your senators or congressmen and women, and some of them not so much. And then we're going to fight like hell. And then the next clip that came up in this bit of videotape, was Kirsty saying, and fight they did. And then you just saw this melee of people fists, and then the breaking in. And I thought that I knew that speech. I was like, hang on a minute, what's going on here? Because I knew that speech was longer than that. And the next day, and sorry, when you're working on Newsnight, you're in this office, the newsroom, the studio's in another part of the building, and you have a live feed, so you can see it going out. And they have guests who are, especially if it's an American thing, they try and get somebody from the right, somebody from the left. And they had, I think his name was Mitch Mulvaney, or Mick McDonald, or whatever, old McDonald from Trump, who used to be in Trump's team. And then they had this woman from BuzzFeed, who is sort of representing the leftist point of view, or the left-wing point of view, or the Democrat point of view. And the guy from Trump's team saying, hang on a minute, you've manipulated that clip. You've put those two bits together, and, it didn't happen that way. And this is one of the things that Trump and the right and MAGA and whatever are battling against every day, which is misrepresentation. And then the next day and I was like, flipping heck, this guy's seen it and he's called it out. That's outrageous. And then, what's her name? The presenter, Kirsty Walk, didn't even respond to that. She didn't apologize, or she. If you watch the clip, she doesn't really react in any way. She goes on to a different question. And then the next day in the editorial meeting, I went along, and because I was the lead designer, and one of the producers said, how on earth did you let that go out to the editor or a very senior figure who was part of the editorial team? And he said, oh, well, it's gone out now, or some words to that effect. And I was like, flipping heck, this is major. And okay, so I'm not a clairvoyant. I had no idea that Trump would get wind of what happened later in 2024, the panorama edit. But I thought, this is really big, and you are manipulating stuff, and this isn't right. And so when a few weeks ago, the Daily Telegraph reported on Panorama had done exactly the same thing, I saw the clip and I thought, bloody hell, I've seen that before. That edit was pretty much the same edit was on Newsnight. And so I got in touch with Telegraph. Now, lots of people say, yes, it is a news organization which has a right-wing bias.
Yeah.
But I'm not part of some right-wing plot. I have no motivation for that. My motivation is the BBC is an institution which prides itself on telling the truth, being the sort of the gold standard of journalism. And I used to love the BBC, and I thought, this is not only is it dereliction of duty, you only have to do things like this a couple of times, James. You only have to make two obvious, lies or mistruths or whatever you want to call them, and people are going to stop believing you.
Yeah.
And my motivation was, I don't want to see the BBC destroyed. I want this BBC to get its act together. I want them to say, hang on a minute, let's look at how this has happened. Let's look at why this has happened. Now, technically, there are two different things going on here as well. Panorama was an outside production. Now, I've worked for the BBC. You have designers and editors who get into the BBC, and you can be sometimes. It's like I worked for an outside broadcast not an outside broadcast, but an outside production. It was a BBC production, but it was made by a third-party production company. I did one for Clive Myrie about the Ukraine war. It was like 1 year on, and I did the graphics for that. And then I also worked on some other productions a long time ago. But basically, this Panorama was created by October Films. They would have had an external production company, producers, editors, whatever. And I thought, where's that editor come from? Is that the same editor that worked on Newsnight? Or is that another editor who'd seen this and just happened to do the same trick twice? But it just smelt fishy to me. And that's why I contacted Telegraph and said, look, I've seen this edit before. And it was just when I was at the BBC, I thought that they were supposed to be non-partisan. I thought that they had to be, that unbiased. And I thought this is impartial. And I thought this is an obvious exercise in not only sort of bias, but extreme bias. And I think sort of segueing into your thing about class is there is a certain class of person within the BBC who works for the BBC, the producers, not so much the technical stuff, maybe, apart from the fact that you see a lot of girls with blue hair, nose rings and stuff like that. But there is within the sort of the hierarchy of the BBC, there are a lot of middle class people, and it's a lot of people joke it's sort of the North London set or the Islington set or whatever it is. It's sort of traditionally white middle class journalists who Guardian readers, that kind of thing, and it's disappointed me. It disappointed me because you work in a political bubble. You work
Mm.
in a ecosystem where they are all believing the same sort of thing. And you have people like me who are a little bit more questioning. There's a couple of other producers or certainly one other producer that I heard who I thought he's offering an alternative point of view, but it's not enough. You need other people with other voices to talk about things and to suggest things outside of that narrow field of view in order to get different perspectives. And
Yeah.
that isn't and a great play is made of diversity these days. It was the sort of watchword, buzzword
Mm.
of a lot of companies, whether that's broadcasters, whether that's other employers, talk about diversity. My concern is diversity of opinion. And I think it was Brexit, and post Brexit and where we are now with the boats, the uncheckered illegal immigration, that certain people are painted in a certain way.
Mm.
And it's very much that I think working class people are. It certainly was with Brexit, it's basically right wing, working class, and especially with the whole immigration thing. Oh, Tommy Robinson, thuggish, that kind of characterization or mischaracterization. Oh, Brexit, you want to leave the EU because you're a racist. And I was, I didn't vote for Brexit because I thought the EU would punish us. I thought that the EU would punish the UK and make an example out of us. And
Mm.
I've got 4 children, and I thought I'm not voting for me, I'm voting for them.
Yeah.
But the way that people who subsequently did vote for Brexit and then were vilified by the BBC and other media organizations as this, whether they were working class or they were morons or they were xenophobes, that kind of mentality also is what anybody who's a Republican in America, it's that kind of we're the righteous left and you are the thugs and the idiots
Mm.
and the hicks and that was my concern and so I might upset some people. I don't give a shit, frankly.
Yeah.
I think that it's really important to be fair to everybody, to actually listen to everybody. And I think, as I said, the diversity, whether that's class opinion, whether you have genuine working class people who can express their beliefs without being vilified or mocked and say, look, I'm really concerned about immigration, or
Mm.
I want to leave the EU because I feel X, Y, and Z. I think that it's important. I think that it's important. Diversity of skin color means nothing, really. I think we personally should, and might be controversial, but I think we should live in a world where we don't notice skin color. It's based on your ability. It's based on your ability to argue cogently for something that you believe in, whether that's right-wing politics, left-wing politics,
Mm.
anything. I think I think it's very dangerous at the BBC. I say dangerous, that's quite hyperbolic, but I think that it's really important that the BBC have different voices, and you see it. It's not just so other examples when I was at the BBC on Newsnight. I remember saying to the editor, and I'm not a, they don't have to listen to the graphic designer. That is not my job. It's producers who come up with stories. And I remember it was around the time of the Just Stop Oil, people throwing orange paint, and somebody got onto the snooker table at the Crucible and opened some orange powder. And I said, why didn't you do, I said this to the editor, why don't you do a story of what would happen if you stopped oil? What actually would happen if the world turned off the tap tomorrow? What could we not make? What would happen to, what would happen to fertilizers? And he said, sort of, nice doggy, go away. But I just think that you need contrary voices.
Yeah.
You need people who, it's like I've heard, and don't think I'm a climate denier. I do believe that the climate is changing. I'm just not so sure about the methods and the science, because I'm not a scientist. We rely on people within television to tell us, that they have looked at the science, that they, and that they have examined it. And you hear stories of within the science community that people who are skeptical of the climate change theories on, it being man-made are, if you question it and you're a scientist, you don't get funding. So I'm not a climate denier. I'm slightly a bit of a COVID skeptic, because I worked as a porter in a hospital and only saw 3 cases of COVID during the whole pandemic. And those were people who had other problems. One of them was a terrible asthmatic. Anyway, I won't go into it, but I've always been questioning, and I've always been not so prepared to take the easy way out. And I think that sort of put me in danger in a way. I mean, I won't be working at the BBC anytime soon. But I think that you've got to have your integrity.
Yeah.
I think you've got to, if you believe in something, it's very hard to be brave enough to say, hang on a minute, because they could just say, I'm not going to hire him.
Yeah.
But if you, if you stay quiet, are you complicit?
If there are no working class voices at the BBC, or if there was, would you have said they were probably too scared to say anything for fear of losing their job and never working at the BBC again?
Okay, so I would say that the working class people that I came across were either socially mobile, i.e. that they were people who had transcended being working class. There were people who were working class. There were other voices. And you find this, and I've heard this in anecdotal stories of communist countries, that people go around whispering that they don't want their views to be heard. That, did you see what they did with the Trump thing? Or, they're doing something about climate change, or whatever it is, or God, he's going on about Brexit again. And you don't speak loudly. Yeah. And you self-censor. And I think that's a dangerous thing for any organization to do, if you have to hide your own point of view.
Do you feel like there was more of an agenda then at the BBC? Because like you said, it's like this middle class group of people. Do you reckon they were it was their viewpoints that they were trying to push?
I don't think necessarily it's trying to push. I think that it's groupthink. I think that if you know that you are going to do a story, let's say if you're making a drama, and if you've got a story and you've got a story about a white working class man in a council estate, or you've got a black woman in a council estate, which one is more likely to be commissioned? So, and if you see other stories, with a black person or, a, a protected group, a Muslim or a, disabled or something like that, you just know that you should focus your attention more on that than the other.
Mm.
Do you see what I mean? And it's the same with education at the moment. White working class boys are doing really badly. They're at the bottom of the pile in terms of achievement.
Yeah.
Why is that happening? Because the focus is on minorities, the focus is on girls, and boys are problematic. And I think that's the same with the BBC, that it's what you focus on because you know that you're gonna like my thing about Just Stop Oil. They kind of laughed it off. And as I said, I'm not a journalist. I'm not there to pitch
Yeah.
ideas. You just know that that isn't going to happen. Somebody is not going to. So, like Clive Murray, very successful black presenter, does the news. I thought he should go to America and look at the black right, because there's a growing political class in America of right-leaning,
Yeah.
voting black Americans who like Trump, they like his swagger, and there are very also traditional Republicans, black Republicans. He should go and look at those people, and it's like, do you think that that's likely that he would, or would it be better to stay with the political class of the BBC?
But I suppose as well, it's like when you're creating news to be factual and not creating news to be entertainment.
No, but I think that, I think the thing is the BBC is a very specific case. So you have the news, and you can look at news through a polarizing filter. You could look at pretty much every story, whether it's a Westminster story, that you could say, Kemi Badenoch has suggested this, and, but the Right Honourable, whoever it is from the left has said this. And it's not necessarily you say that the Conservatives are crazy or something. It's the weight that you give the left's response. It's the weight that you give. It's the way you sort of dismiss people, other people, voices. It's like I saw an interview with Emily Maitlis after she'd left. What do you call it? Left Newsnight, and she's got this at her own podcast, and she was talking to a man talking about the Pakistani rape gangs, the grooming gangs, and this man was talking about them, and she said, "So you're basically a racist then?" And it's like the R word, accusing somebody of racism is like the kiss of death in society. If you're called a racist, you're a bigot, you can't think, you just see people's color, etc. And it's just a way of instantly shutting somebody down. And that shouldn't be happening in news.
No.
That was obviously outside of the BBC, but it's a very, very easy way to shut somebody down. And I think that the BBC are in danger of doing that. They also can't seem to say sorry. It's like after the Panorama thing, the Tim Davie, the head man, fell on his sword and resigned, and then the head of news, and no point did they say, look, we massively fucked up. this should never have gone out. It's an obvious, I don't know whether it was the producer who okayed this. I don't know why it went out like this. I don't know what checks were failed, and they should be having a long, dark night of the soul and saying, and because there's not only is it news and current affairs, they're an entertainment channel as well.
Yeah.
And they're the Reithian, what is it? They're not, I was going to say the Reithian promise, but Lord Reith's remit of the BBC is to inform, educate, and entertain. And now you are having, in the sort of entertainment and education, you have, let's say, horrible histories. And you have, in horrible histories, you have Black Romans being in Britain. Now, there is no evidence of Black Romans being in Britain. I've got nothing against Black people, but I think that you should tell the truth. You should tell the truth. Were the Romans, you're painting a false picture. And if you're educating children, they need to know the truth, and you have, in the entertainment field, you have Doctor Who, and you have Doctor Who meeting non-binary aliens, and that's like, how long has the whole gender debate been going on? Is in the last 10 years, and that suddenly found itself into entertainment. And why are those stories getting into entertainment? Is it an idea? Now, I don't think they sit down and say, we need to do some more social engineering here. We need to promote more gay people and trans people, and we need to have more Black people. But you've got to question, who are they writing this
where's
stuff
these
for?
decisions coming from? If there were more like working class and diverse voices from those kind of groups, do you feel like the BBC would be a much different place then?
I think so. I think that if you had senior people within the BBC and not so senior people who represented a diversity of voices, whether that's working class people, whether that's people from the right, people from the center, who weren't afraid to speak out, weren't afraid to question things, weren't afraid to go with the orthodoxy of the BBC, to break out of the what do you call it, the Guardian mentality, that ecosystem. One of the stories I told on a different podcast was I was listening to a senior correspondent talking about the insurrection. And he said, the insurrection is because Trump believes in this conspiracy theory called QAnon. And it was supposed to be this shadowy figure who had somehow swung the election, and that's why the Democrats had won. And later on, I said to this senior guy, I said, where did you get that story about the QAnon thing? And he said, it was on this other senior correspondent podcast. He explained it all. And I was like, so you're getting your news from another BBC source. That's it. You haven't looked elsewhere. And it's like, at the time around, I don't know how much you followed the American election, there was evidence that the Democrats or their supporters were registering dead people to vote. And we're not talking about one or two, we're talking about hundreds in swing states. And we also had the collusion between Facebook and I think it was before Musk owned Twitter, the collusion of these media companies that wouldn't allow the story of Hunter Biden's laptop, which had all these incriminating documents on it, and images of him smoking crack and alleged deals with the Ukraine, and but basically showing a sort of a bent organization. And where was that on the BBC? Where was the discussion around that kind of thing, which you could see on the internet if you wanted to find it, if you had a broad view, but it's just basically this sort of bubble.
Because you have worked across like ITV,
Yes.
advertising and film. In terms of class across those, did you ever see anything that differed from the BBC, or was it kind of similar?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, the ITV was a very different organization. It's a commercial channel. It had a very, very different outlook and aspect, and it had many more people, I would say, from very mixed backgrounds, and not just left wing. I worked with a guy called Bob Massey, and a woman called Natalka Zanak, who invented the I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of It here. And Bob Massey had been at Big Breakfast, and I'd worked with Breakfast before that. And they were very much, they were working class kids who were making good TV, and also at Planet 24, it didn't really matter what class you were, just as you were good,
Making
good
good
at your job.
programming,
Yeah. And I think that very much you find in the film industry, and it's slightly around the trades, there are a hell of a lot of working class people in film, whether that's in doing lighting, whether that's rigging, whether that's gaffers, whether that's people building sets. They're very well paid working class people, but they are working class, and the British craftsmanship is why George Lucas made Star Wars in the United Kingdom, is because we were, okay, so we had cups of tea in the middle. Apparently, this infuriated the Americans, British insisting on a tea break, but at the same time, we were the best craftsmen. Who just got stuff done, and it really was. Oh, governor, like.
proper labourers, proper doing the traders.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what you get in, and I think that is missing. And I think, and I hate to say this, James, but it's to do with the education system.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, because you have worked in education as well, so you would have seen that aspect.
And I think that now, and it was Blair's big idea was to put people into education, and when I went to college, there was 15% of people went into further education, i.e. university, and now it's about 50%.
Yeah.
And
it's quite high.
a lot of, it's very high. And I think that a lot of people are being sort of pushed towards the university career or education. And I don't think a lot of people are right for that. And I think that, and I don't want to get anybody into trouble, but I think that in education, there's very much a left-wing mindset. There's very much we are the good guys, all the right wing, everybody, all the billionaires, all the capitalist bastards. It's that kind of mentality that's sort of the left. And there's a cynicism growing within young people, young kids who are not buying this stuff anymore. And I also think that we're missing a trick in this country, that we really should be pushing or developing, and I know the government at one stage were trying to get more people into apprenticeships. As I said, I have children, and one of my children went into education and saddled with a bloody massive debt, and two of them did a trade apprenticeship and earned money and have a wonderful life now and are financially free. They've bought their own properties, and and they're very young, and they did it by working, and they have time to explore whatever they want to explore in other parts of their life and interests outside of their work. And they're not they don't have a lack of intellectual rigor for the fact that they didn't go to university. You can still read books, you can still watch documentaries, you can still learn about stuff whilst you're not at university. I think that there's a danger of snobbery for working class people outside of the education system. And that's obviously wrong.
You briefly mentioned earlier on that you worked at a hospital as a porter, and traditionally that would probably be seen as a working class role. And coming from your background as graphic design, how was that for you working?
I think the thing is that I worked in a hospital when I was a teenager, and just as a cleaner, just as a summer job. And when the whole lockdown came, and I thought, I don't want to sit around at home. I'm bored of this. I want to be where the action is. And so signed up to become a porter and wheel people around between different wards. And there were a whole load of people from very different backgrounds. Majority were working class, I suppose, one or two middle class people. I think that I've been able to rubber along with people of any class, color, or background. It really doesn't worry me as long as people are, genuinely decent.
Yeah.
And it was, it's funny because there is a slight aspect if you're middle class and you speak the way I do, James. Not like a bloody hike. How dare you? But you do get people taking the piss out of you.
Yeah.
One of my sons had this enormously when he was learning to be a carpenter. They would say, is Jeeves making your sandwiches again? And
Yeah,
he would say,
it's quite funny you say that, because it's like it's kind of flip reversal role when someone from working class is working in a high professional environment. They're the ones that get the stick. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what happened to me a little bit. I found it. I enjoyed it. It was interesting to see the COVID pandemic from the inside. Quite how many people were suffering from this was minute compared to what was being reported. Everybody who came into the hospital was suspected COVID. You'd get this. We had these iPhones with this system that you get an alert. You pick somebody up. Somebody needs to be picked up from this ward and go to that ward. Somebody's going for an operation or whatever, and the patient's details would be on there, so that you could greet them, and when you got to the ward, to make sure that you're pulling the right person out. And they're supposed to be in bed 16 and their name is X, and if they're compos mentis, you can say, is your name X?
Yeah.
And every single person had suspected COVID on, but that's a different story. But I got on very well with, and you get arseholes in every job. You get arseholes in every position. There were people who'd been builders, there were people who had been groundsmen, there were people who'd been hairdressers. there was, there was a couple of middle-class guys. One of them, I think, he'd been a graphic designer. There were Filipinos. There were a Polish guy who was very abrupt, who'd been who was a chef. David, get the on with it.
I suppose it's all
Obviously,
because of the circumstance, because of it was going through COVID. I suppose everyone's kind of rolling it together regardless of your
yeah.
background. So,
Yeah,
in
but
that
I don't
instance,
think. I worked when I was a teenager. I was 16. I worked at a hospital as a cleaner. I think it was for a month or even shorter than that at a geriatric hospital. What was called a geriatric, they wouldn't call them that now. It was hell on earth. I'd never seen anything like it. I thought I never want to die in hospital, in an old people's hospital. And I hadn't come across working class people. I had been very much in my own sort of class bubble. And I went and worked with these ladies, and they were swearing every other word. They were talking about, oh, my husband's going to get this pornographic tape or something. And I was sort of like, I was shocked, I was so green. I was so naive. And they opened my eyes, like talking about pornography, that there was an ice cream van. And the ice cream van not only sold ice creams, but under the counter, he had a huge collection of
yeah,
pornographic videotapes that he would rent out to people. And I think he was also might have been dealing hashish or
yeah,
anyway. But I was just like, what? I was so naive and so closeted. And then these ladies were, oh, my darling,
it's quite the eye
and
opener.
yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because it's really important to meet people outside of your and it's funny because, as I said, I came from this bubble, and that was my sort of shocking awakening to class divide. And I remember my first week at further education college, because what happened was I broke my arm really badly and had to go to have series of operations. And my mother, who was a teacher, spent all her wages sending me to a prep school, which is a under 13 school, and I did relatively well there. So she said, "Do you want to go on to, a boarding school?" And so I was in that world. And I remember when I left at 16, my mother, to be honest with you, found it very expensive to keep me there. And I had to go. And I remember in my further education class, there was a girl we were doing Chaucer, and she said, "Well, I reckon that the wife of Bath went there, and did whatever." And I was like, my God, there's somebody with a Berkshire accent, but they're actually quite intelligent. I was such a stuck-up git.
But that's still what, like you said, if you're in this bubble, you wouldn't know any different, would you?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And I wasn't. And I think it's really important to hear people's
yeah,
perspectives and hear people's points of view, and not just think diversity means skin color. It's diversity of views, it's diversity of background.
Was there anything like any final words you wanted to say, or like parting thoughts or anything like that?
Um, I don't know who your podcast is focused at. Who is your audience,
To
Jane?
be honest, it's kind of just shining a light on those from working class backgrounds and lower income households, and it's kind of just
Okay.
giving those kind of stories so people hear what it's actually really like, especially for those that have managed to break into their respective industry. So it's kind of that side of things. Originally, it was catered more towards creative sector, but it's a much broader issue.
Broader thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you and I both met each other at an advertising agency, didn't we?
Yeah.
I would say that at an advertising agency, you've got more chance as a working class person, because there are many more working class people there. I wouldn't say let that stop you applying anywhere for any kind of job. And I think that you are going to get narrow-minded people, whether that's what I face working with these, women cleaners. But I think the thing is that now we live in such a democratic age, and I'm talking about the democracy of ideas, the democracy of learning. Let's say if you're really into film, you don't have to have a job in film to make films. If you have a love of fresco painting, you don't have to work with a fresco painter. All the information that you need to do what you want to do is online. And I think, okay, you might not get the job that you absolutely love, but you can still follow what you want to do. You can still make your passion pay. I still think that you can work really, really hard. I think that anybody who wants to work hard is going to make it, whatever their class. To be honest with you, I think that it comes down to hard work, dedication, and I think that I think another thing now, and this is in the last 10, 15 years, we are being told that certain people haven't got a chance because of their skin color, because of you're disabled, because you're a woman, because you are working class. That's utter bullshit. The only people who are doing the victimizing is yourself. Don't be a victim of your own belief that you're inferior or your belief that you are oppressed or whatever it is. That's utter fucking bullshit. Work hard and you will achieve. That's my message to the youth.
Thanks again for coming on and lifting the lid on Newsnight and stuff like that. If anyone wanted to kind of get in touch with you or find out what you're up to, do you have any have you got LinkedIn or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn.
I can share the details in the description.
Yeah. I mean, I tell you what, I have an Instagram which is called Motion Old Boy, and I sketch, and occasionally I put some of my adventures in media in there. Like I do very little graphic design these days. I work with people who I want to work with, and that's very few. And very few people want to work with me, probably. And I had health problems, so I try and work as little as possible. I've had heart problems, and so on my Motion Old Boy, I didn't sketch. I haven't sketched since I was 19, so that's 30 something odd years, and I've been sketching for the last 2 years, and that's my Instagram.
Yeah.
I love sketching, and I'm doing sort of more vaguely cartoon type drawing, and that's my passion. So I'm on there. I love films. I love making films, and I love talking too much.
Cool. I'll share that on the description, and thanks again for talking.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Initial Step. If you resonate with the stories we share and have a similar background you'd like to talk about, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch and maybe you'll be featured in an upcoming episode. And don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Be sure to check out our previous episodes for more inspiring stories. Until next time, I'll see you on the next one.